Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Catch Up Canes. This time over the summer, it's your host Sophia Metzner, and today we have a super special guest for us to go over a publication. Nkosi, a recent PhD graduate from the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science, will be joining us to talk about the annual Best Student Publication Prize that he was awarded for his outstanding publication on how heat hazards in low latitudes differ from heat hazards in other places. So, first off, congratulations on wrapping up your PhD at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School and receiving this prestigious recognition. How does it feel to have your work formally recognized at the end of your doctoral journey?
Good. Well, firstly, thank you for having me. It's cool because this is a paper that I worked on for literally like over a year. It was something that was under review, an intense review, for a long period of time. Usually some papers, I mean, papers take 1 to 2 years sometimes, on the long end, but while you're also working on other papers at the same time and trying to finish a dissertation, it's a lot. So it was really cool to have it recognized and to hopefully more lean into it, not just because it's a publication, but more so that it's one that is laying the groundwork for some work that we're actually doing when it comes to just heat hazards as a whole. I'm pretty sure everybody in Miami knows that it's hot.
Yeah.
So this is, one of those papers that kind of gets at, the basis of why it's so hot in certain places at certain times of year.
Yeah, that goes right into my next question of what was like the motivation behind this. Obviously, you said the publication took so long to write, so it was like the main reason or main argument that you think this topic is so urgent for today.
Yeah, I mean, so overall, we're dealing with a heat that's different in Miami and places that are adjacent to the tropics, that are different than other places in like, where I'm from, New Jersey or Chicago or maybe like a Phoenix, right? We're dealing with a humid heat hazard. And as such, we have to measure it differently. We have to approach it differently. We have to respond to it and adapt to it differently. So one of the ways that we do that first is by how do we identify hazards? And a lot of times people use land surface temperature as a way to identify heat hazards because land surface temperature is usually strongly correlated with the air temperature that we feel. It's been, documented across many different geographies, climate types, but it may not always be the case in a place where cloud cover is constantly in the way of, the radiation from reaching the ground. So just to give a background on what land surface temperature is, essentially just a representation of how warm the surface is or how much the surface is absorbed, how much energy or radiation the surface has absorbed. So essentially what the satellites do is measure all that radiation coming back up from the surface, known as long wave radiation. And the thing is, the surface can't absorb radiation if there's, significant obstructions in the way, like clouds or intense air moisture, right? So in a place that has a lot of air moisture and a lot of clouds, what does that mean, for how we look at land surface temperature and what it means for the air temperature that we feel and heat index and things like that, right? So in a nutshell, we just wanted to see, can we use land surface temperature here the same way we use it in other places? And we saw that during certain times of year, you cannot.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting to think about the seasons. I don't think a lot of people would necessarily think about that for Miami.
Mhm.
Doing so much research like that, did you see an overlap as a previous Division I athlete between your discipline as an athlete and your resilience as a researcher for these past 5 years at the University of Miami?
It's an interesting question. Um, I mean, I think as an athlete, you have a competitive spirit, I think you also have a level of discipline that's needed, to be able to get tasks done. Um, Obviously, being an athlete in college and also studying a field, that's a STEM field, I think I learned very quickly that I had to, improve my time management and become more disciplined if I wanted to achieve or excel in both. Um, One took more precedent, as you can see, which is why I ended up doing a PhD. But I think, the lessons that I learned as far as like time management and discipline and being able to stay, on a certain timeline, because when you're publishing a paper, you have to adhere to timelines, you have to submit, revisions by and all those different things, but also just staying kind of mentally tough because academia can be really rough. You can, sometimes publish or submit a paper and somebody can look at it and be like, what is this? And it's something that you put like all your work into, right? Or like your heart and soul to for a certain period of time. So at first, there was definitely a reviewer that saw it and was like, it was kind of like, did you even read the paper? Did you read what I submitted? And it was really frustrating. But just knowing that nothing comes easy, it was kind of like, all right, well, let's try this again from this angle. And ultimately, it worked out. So
That's awesome. You were able to go over that and kind of overcome those little challenges with other reviewers and stuff. So I saw that you also were vice chair of the Climate Resilience Committee in the city of Miami, which emphasizes equity and inclusion in climate policy. So how do you think that the heat hazards kind of intersect with existing social qualities in these low latitude cities towards?
yeah, I mean, the socioeconomic components are something that we see pretty much everywhere, right? So across the United States, we've had a historic disinvestment in certain neighborhoods, and a lot of times that comes with, a lack of heat adaptation strategies or just climate resilient strategies as a whole, right? So if we were to compare the tree canopy in Coral Gables to the tree canopy in, Allapattah or Liberty City or Little Haiti, there's going to be a stark contrast, right? And I wish I could like show the picture that actually shows the difference. When I usually talk about the difference or the disparity in tree canopy, it's actually insane. And it leads to why, certain areas that absorb more heat throughout the course of the day would be warmer, right? And I think something on top of that, in a climate like Miami's, since we're going to lead more into the low latitude phenomenon here, or the low latitude topic here, a lot of our heat, strategies, a lot of the times are focused on how people experience heat indoors. So like air conditioning, super important, right? Not everybody can afford air conditioning. So actually another paper that was published not too long ago by one of my colleagues, she led that paper, where we actually put sensors inside people's homes. We're able to see that, well, not everybody can run their AC all day because if they do, their energy bill is going to be way too high. They can't afford that. So they kind of cope with it in the best ways that they can. Um, and those may not be as effective in humid climates like Miami's as opposed to, other places where you can open your window, you can open a door, and your house cools down a bit, right? So there's a lot of different factors that play into it. The socioeconomic components, the historic disinvestment through redlining and things like that, and then just, current day disparities that we see in a city or a county that still has like very, very large socioeconomic disparities to this day.
Absolutely. And it only, I think, continues to grow as I've seen in a lot of my classes. So it's amazing that you're working so hard to combat that. What policy recommendations that emerge from your study do you hope urban planners and decision makers will act on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one was one that was actually included in the city of Miami's heat, extreme heat plan, which is okay, we need to have other ways to be able to measure and identify heat hazards in a place like Miami, because if we use just land surface temperature alone, we're probably going to end up underestimating what the hazard actually is. So if the land surface temperature in a certain area is 28 degrees Celsius, which is, about I think just short of 80 degrees, maybe a little higher. But the air temperature is like, 90, we could see that disparity, just because the land surface is not as warm because of cloud cover and things like that, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think another thing too is just the importance of tree canopy. So making sure that we're prioritizing trees and not just palm trees because they look pretty, but trees that actually shade the surface, right, and keep people cooler. One of the biggest things we saw is that even though it may be humid outside, I think the biggest thing that makes people feel really hot is just intense solar radiation a lot of the time. So if that solar radiation is beaming down on you and on the surface, there's kind of like a double whammy there because you're feeling the heat from the surface and you're also feeling the heat, from the actual sun rays, right? Shortwave and long wave radiation. But not to get too technical, those are just things that, we can prevent if we have more trees in certain neighborhoods. We have more reflective pavements. We have cool roofs, green roofs, things like that. Things that, I think that actually University of Miami's pushing forward, to or trying to lean towards too. I know Teddy with the sustainability department is also thinking about those things as well. So just moving forward, more heat resilient strategies is, I think, the underlying basis of why we're doing this work.
Yeah, it's a great point. I had watched one of your previous videos that you had talked about an interview about how it's difficult to plant trees in Miami because there's a bunch of different regulations. That's another interesting thing to think about for legislators when you're going to these committees and trying to present why these canopies need to be presented. So now I have some questions about your personal journey and like perspective of why you kind of got into this field and are doing all this stuff. So I am also a Jersey native myself from Basking Ridge, and as someone from Somerset, New Jersey, how has growing up in New Jersey kind of shaped your understanding of the regional differences in climate impacts?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I always wanted to go to UM. Like even after high school, like I applied to go to UM.
Mhm.
It just didn't work out in that time of life, and for good reason. But I think in Jersey, you experience all four seasons, right? And very intensely, as I'm sure you know. So
Absolutely, yeah.
being able to experiencing the difference in between how Miami experiences climate and then how New Jersey experiences it, it's different. I always tell people, I don't think, when I do community work, I don't think that like I was very privileged when it came to being shielded from climate hazards. I think the only significant climate event that I remember happening, what year were you born? You don't mind me asking?
2005. So, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so for me, it was Floyd in 1999, Hurricane Floyd. So like
Mhm.
Hurricane Floyd flooded out like all of New Jersey and New York. It was just an intense rainstorm. And I was only 6 at the time, but I remember still like my dad having to run into the basement to like turn the pump on to like make sure our basement didn't flood out. It was
Yeah.
just, I've never seen that much rain until I got to Miami. So that being a regular occurrence in Miami, especially in the spring and the summer and the late fall, and definitely during hurricane season, there was like a contrast there. It was like, all right, New Jersey is okay. We still should prepare, but like Miami needs help. Like immediately,
Mhm.
we're not in the sense of we being Miami is not ready for hurricanes or any of the extreme climate hazards that we see, right? So, just not necessarily taking my experience from Jersey, but just knowing that like there's a disparity in how places are prepared for climate hazards, and I think that that's something that became very relevant to me once I got, or obvious to me once I got to Miami.
Absolutely. I would completely agree with you. I'm taking climate change classes right now and just seeing the difference between the coast of Florida, where we are in Miami, and the way that they need to prepare is just absolutely insane compared to being so, like you said, kind of shielded away from it up in Jersey and just having it in your backyard now that you're in Miami.
Right.
I wanted to ask, reflecting on your academic journey, because you mentioned that you did not go to UM after high school and you went from UNC Charlotte to Georgia State and now full circle, I guess, back at UM. How has your perspective on climate vulnerability kind of evolved over time through your collegiate career?
Yeah, I started actually my first 2 years of undergrad were in upstate New York at the University in Albany, which has one of the best like atmospheric science programs in the country. I didn't know that at the time, and that's why the program whipped my butt the way that it did. But it was I remember just being, a kid that just loved weather and then kind of like followed it. And that ended up, me going to Albany, studying meteorology, atmospheric science. And then ultimately, when I got to Charlotte, excuse me, when I got to Charlotte, it was just kind of like, all right, well, I really need to understand these fundamentals of the dynamics are behind the atmosphere, what controls this, what controls that, so I could actually be able to talk about it in the ways that like I've always wanted to, right? And that's why I always tell people it's easier to go from the science to the communication rather than the communication to the science because you actually understand it and can communicate it in a way that's everybody can understand, right? Which is another skill in itself. But not to go on a tangent. Once I finished at Charlotte, I knew that something that I really wanted to lean into were the applications of weather, the applications of climate, what that means for society as a whole. I didn't just want to, tell people if they need an umbrella every day or not, which is important, but I think my purpose was calling me to do something more.
Mhm.
So a lot of the internships that I participated in, in Colorado, in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, they were based on like research projects that had societal impacts. So like what does, a certain climate disaster, what is the damage that is caused, what's the trend in the images that we're seeing, things like that, right? How do we prepare people, for a severe weather, alert in their neighborhood per se, right? Um, how are models capturing hurricanes per se? Are we improving or are we, we not improving? Is there something else that we need to change? And then when I got to Georgia State, um, there's when I really learned about justice, the justice aspect, and how the social really intertwines with climate.
Mhm.
So my thesis at Georgia State, my master's thesis was focused on more so like really the environmental justice components of different climate hazards, so flooding, heat, drought. What does that mean for certain neighborhoods in Atlanta? Um, and then when I spoke to my advisor here at University of Miami, she was like, "You should do more of this work, but focused on heat here in Miami." So it was kind of like a journey that evolved, and it really all started because I read a book called The Color of Law. And that book was kind of really what highlighted like, wow, there are disparities and that also social disparities and that also impacts how people experience climate. So it really evolved once I think, I got to Georgia State. I started leaning into more of the social. And then that only kind of intensified once I got to Miami and saw the same kind of trends.
Absolutely. I've been lucky enough that a lot of my classes at the University of Miami do highlight the social injustices that are involved with climate change and climate extreme weather events, because I think that that's often been overlooked as academia, which is why I highlighted why that you've really worked hard to push that and kind of push the disparities. Just out of curiosity, what is your favorite extreme weather event to follow and study?
Um, I think since I've been in Miami, it's become hurricanes. It used to be tornadoes just because they're just really they're insane phenomena. But I think when I got to Miami, just like seeing for more than just like how cool they are, which I shouldn't be saying out loud because yeah, they are really cool, but they're also really dangerous.
Yeah. Mhm.
It's seeing how much of an impact it has on people, and not just the hurricane itself, but the before and the after. So a hurricane means for somebody, after it passes, their power is out in Miami heat, what does that mean for their health, right? What does it mean for them being able to recover from the storm? So, um, I don't know. You asked me a question about like, which one do I want to follow the most, or which one is my favorite to follow? And really, it's yeah, just the scientific part is hurricanes because they're just incredible. But I think over time, it became something that I really became interested in because they really, really affect people. And not that tornadoes don't, because they also do, but hurricanes have much longer lasting impacts, and they can last for days to weeks at a time. So I think hurricanes, ironically.
Oh, great answer. Yeah. Um, I totally agree with you living. I mean, obviously it's such a big thing going to UM and seeing all that and even just going to the coast, seeing the destruction of hurricanes has been definitely an eye-opener for me personally, and I'm sure you too. So you mentioned going and seeing that and looking at how the heat, extreme heat is also impacting that. So going forward and looking on to your legacy, now that you've officially finished your PhD, what's next? Like, do you plan to stay in academia, work in government, or something else? What plans do you have for your future?
You flattered me using the word legacy. I don't know if I have that yet, but I think, well, what I am doing is actually moved to Cambridge Cambridge, Massachusetts, later in July because I'm starting an environmental fellowship at Harvard. So I'll kind of continue doing
Congratulations.
thank you. I'll continue doing some of the same work that I've been doing because we've started this research agenda and now we're just going to continue it. Um, Overall, I know where I want to be is at the intersection between, climate policy and how we communicate it. So whatever that looks like, I could not tell you what kind of job that is yet. I don't know what the title is for it yet,
Mhm.
but I want to be able to translate the science into, effective policy over time. Science communication has always been my passion. I find it fun. It's just a easy way for me to nerd out and then also allow other people to get included, in that nerd process. It's incredible to see people that have never really been exposed to science before, like learn about it and be like, wow, like this is something that affects me on a daily basis too, right? So, um, whatever that looks like, that's kind of what I'm going to be chasing over time. And sure, I could do that from academia. It's an option, but we'll see. We'll see. So I'll take it. I've always been somebody that's just kind of followed the breadcrumbs, as they've been put in front of me, and I think that's something that I'll continue doing here.
Yeah, I think whatever you do, it sounds like you've already been very successful. So I think whatever you do, I hope to hear about you in the future and what you do going forward. So lastly, I guess to end it off, as such a strong advocate that's spoken to so many sustainability events yourself, what is one piece of advice you would give to University of Miami students for ways they can be more climate conscientious or ways they could like take action in the community where we're going to school in the surrounding Miami area?
Yeah. I always tell people I don't think the climate crisis is on any individual. I don't think that that's one thing that any student themselves can solve. So, you know, obviously we all, order our Amazon packages and we drive, and we, do things that may not be the most climate friendly. Um, and that's understandable because we all have to live, right? But something that you can do, you absolutely can do, is get more involved in your community. You can go to City Hall, you can stay more informed with what's going on in the news, We're seeing a lot of rollbacks from climate things now, A lot of people may feel helpless in those places, but you can go to City Hall locally, we can be an example locally, it may spread to other places. Go to City Hall and tell your commissioners, like, hey, we need to focus more on planting trees in these areas. How can we modify, the legislation or these zoning things that are in the way of us planting trees so that we can have a more equitable tree canopy, across the city. Um, Doing the advocating for the same things on campus too, making sure that we're also involved, with how our own campus is, or our own university is contributing to the climate crisis, right? Who are we being funded by? Those different kinds of things are all really, really important. Um, yeah, I would say staying informed and educating others by also being educated yourself is probably the best thing. It may not have immediate impact, but the more people know, what it is they can do, what it is they haven't been doing, what it is that's going on is a way to, just spread, an entire wave of awareness that I think can really help us, adapt better because that's the thing we're going to have to do. And then eventually, mitigate some of the climate hazards that we're dealing with. So I would say that.
Absolutely. I know I'm certainly inspired by everything that you've done and do want to make more actions toward climate change. So hopefully our listeners out there also have learned a lot from this talk. And again, congratulations on your award. It's so amazing that you've earned that as a final for kind of everything cultivated at the University of Miami. And we're lucky to have had you for the past 5 years working with the Rosenstiel School. But thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank
And
you.
um, that's all. Thank you, listeners, and hope you guys have learned so much about this chat and everything and are empowered to take action towards climate change because it is a very impeding issue, especially in Miami. And we have to, the more action that we all take and more people are involved in this, the more progress we can make. But thank you again.
Thanks for having me.